The marble steps of the United States Supreme Court were quiet that morning. Unusually quiet. Not because there weren't people there, were crowds outside, gathered like it was the Oscars. But inside, within the towering columns and centuries-old architecture, the hush was almost sacred. And down that central aisle, moving slowly but purposefully, was Robert De Niro. 81 years old, two-time Oscar winner, a face etched into American culture. But today, he wasn't here as Vito Corleone or Travis Bickle or any other character he'd brought to life across half a century of filmmaking. Today, he was just Robert, a citizen, a man staring down the possibility of jail time for a crime of violence or fraud, but for words, for criticism, for saying out loud what many thought but were too afraid to speak. Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat on the bench, stone-faced, the gavel resting lightly beneath her fingers, her robe crisp, her expression unreadable. This wasn't theater. This was the highest court in the land. But if you listened closely past the silence, past the tension, past the centuries of ritual, you could almost hear it, the stage being set for a performance unlike any other. And not just a performance, a reckoning. Because 3 months earlier, De Niro had spoken into a microphone during an interview with The New Yorker and, with typical bluntness, said what he believed, that the Supreme Court was losing its way, that justices like Barrett had begun to serve ideology more than the Constitution, that rulings weren't just wrong, they were dangerous. The reaction was immediate. Cable news picked it up within hours. Social media exploded. Clips of De Niro's gravelly voice, his narrowed eyes flooded TikTok, Instagram, even LinkedIn. The right denounced him as arrogant, out of touch, even un-American. The left hailed him as a truth teller. But the controversy might have fizzled out, like they always do, if De Niro hadn't doubled down. At the Kennedy Center, receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award, he stood at the podium with the spotlight warming his shoulders and spoke again, this time to a crowd of artists, journalists, even politicians. "I've played judges in movies," he said, "and the good ones, they don't reach for a conclusion and bend the law to fit it. They start with the law and go where it leads seven when it's hard, even when it's unpopular." It wasn't just a jab, it was a challenge. And Justice Barrett, watching the clip on her office screen 2 days later, felt it. This wasn't about politics, she thought. This was about the dignity of the court. And so, in a move unprecedented in recent decades, her office issued a formal notice. Robert De Niro was being summoned. Not to testify in a case, not to receive an honor, but to answer for his words before the full bench of the United States Supreme Court. That letter hit the news like a thunderclap. The word contempt started trending. Think pieces appeared overnight. Pundits on both sides questioned the legality, the optics, the risk. But De Niro, he didn't blink. In fact, he wrote back within 48 hours. Hand-signed, old school, like someone raised in a time when words mattered. "If Justice Barrett believes my speech amounts to contempt of court," he wrote, "then I would like to explain myself directly, in person, in front of the justices." And now here he was. He walked toward the bench with the slow grace of a man who's lived through decades of fame, of failure, of this country at its best and worst. His suit was classic navy, his tie tight. He held no papers, no briefcase, just a pocket constitution and a weathered look that said, "I've seen worse than this. Let's go." In the gallery, his daughter sat in the front row, face unreadable. Next to her, Al Pacino, aged but fierce, leaned forward like a boxer studying his opponent. The press was jammed into every corner. Even the air felt tight. Like it, too, was waiting to exhale. Chief Justice Roberts opened the proceeding with a steady voice. "Mr. De Niro, this court does not take matters of contempt lightly. You've been granted the rare opportunity to respond directly to concerns raised by Justice Barrett and others regarding your public statements about this court." De Niro nodded. Not dramatically, not for show, just a simple nod like, "Understood." And then he began. "Your Honors, thank you, not for the spectacle, not for the headlines, but for allowing me to speak not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as an American. His voice filled the chamber. Gravelly, yes. Weathered, sure, but strong. I was raised in a time when you didn't talk politics at the dinner table, when you didn't question authority, not loudly. But I've also lived through times when silence was the real danger. The 60s, Watergate, 9/11s, Trump, COVID, Charlottesville. I've watched America bend, sometimes break, but I always believed we had something solid beneath it all, something worth arguing over, something worth protecting. He paused, eyes scanning the bench, and that something is the Constitution. Justice Barrett leaned slightly forward, pen in hand. No emotion, just attention. I criticized your decisions, Niro continued. Yes, I used your name. Yes, and I stand by it. Not because I enjoy conflict. Believe me, I've had enough critics to last 3 lifetimes. But because when people with your power make rulings that affect millions, the rest of us have not just the right, but the duty to speak up. There was a murmur in the gallery, a shuffle of fabric, the kind of silence that grows heavier the longer it stretches. Barrett spoke. Mr. Niro, this court is not above critique, but your remarks implied that I, and perhaps others on this bench, act with bias, that we disregard our oath for ideology. That, sir, is more than criticism. That is an accusation. Niro didn't flinch. I understand, but let me ask you this. If I, as a citizen, believe that trend exists, is it contempt or is it patriotism? Barrett's eyes narrowed. The manner of delivery matters, she said. Niro stepped 1 pace closer, not a threat, just presence. Justice Barrett, I was raised by an artist mother and a working-class father. We weren't rich, we weren't powerful, but they taught me 2 things. Speak clearly and stand your ground. My mother always said, don't whisper the truth when they shout the lie. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, beat-up copy of the Constitution. Not dramatic, just honest. This book, he said, holding it up, belongs to me. It belongs to all of us, not just lawyers, not just judges. And when I see decisions that seem to shrink the space for rights, reproductive rights, voting rights, speech, I speak. Because if someone like me doesn't, who will? A beat passed. Justice Clarence Thomas broke the silence. Mr. Niro, with all due respect, you are not a constitutional scholar. This court interprets the law as written. Your interpretation, based on emotion or politics, is not jurisprudence. Niro turned his head slowly. You're right. I'm not a scholar. I don't pretend to be. But the Constitution wasn't written in Latin. It was written for farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, and yeah, actors. I may not know every precedent, but I know when something feels wrong. That landed. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward, her eyes flickering with curiosity. And what would you propose, Mr. Niro? That we poll the public before each decision? That we legislate from the bench? Niro smiled, just a hint. No, I'm saying the public has a voice too. And sometimes that voice is raised in frustration, or fear, or fury, but it's still a voice, and it still matters. He turned back to Barrett. I don't question your intelligence, or your belief in your role. I question the direction. I question what happens when courts forget they're servants of the people, not the other way around. Barrett's expression flickered, maybe frustration, maybe reflection. It was hard to tell, but Niro kept going. My father once told me, in this country, the minute they tell you not to speak, Speak louder. I've never forgotten that. And I've never stopped believing in the promise of this place, even when I've seen its flaws up close. He held up the Constitution again, then gently placed it on the podium. This, he said, isn't a prop, it's a promise, one I intend to keep. There was silence, thick, uncomfortable, historic. And then Justice Barrett did something no one expected. She looked him in the eye and nodded, once. Then she leaned back and said, almost softly, "You've given us much to consider." No ruling, not yet, just a pause, a breath, a recognition. And that's how history shifted, not with a verdict, not with a shout, but with a man standing tall, saying what he believed, and refusing to sit down until he was heard. Outside the courtroom, the air had changed. It wasn't celebration, not yet. But it wasn't outrage either, something more cautious. A kind of alert calm, like people sensed the ground beneath them might be moving, but weren't sure yet in which direction. Reporters rushed to file early quotes. Constitutional law professors started dissecting Niro's words before the session had even ended. And inside the chamber, the justices remained seated, unusually still, like they weren't quite ready to let go of the moment. Because whatever anyone thought about Robert De Niro's politics, his tone, or his choice of words, one thing was clear. He had spoken not like an actor playing a role, but like a citizen who had lived enough life to speak without fear. Justice Barrett glanced down at her notepad, then up again at De Niro. "This court," she said slowly, "does not consider itself above criticism. But the manner in which that criticism is delivered reflects on our national discourse. Mr. De Niro, you clearly believe you're fulfilling a civic duty." "I am," he said simply. Justice Gorsuch leaned forward now. "So tell us," he asked, almost curiously, "what do you believe this court has lost?" De Niro took a breath. "Connection," he said, "to people, to everyday Americans. This place, this room, it's grand, it's beautiful. But sometimes I think the higher up you go, the harder it is to hear what people are really saying on the ground." He paused, letting it sit. "I've walked neighborhoods where people don't even know the names of you folks. They just know what it feels like when a ruling drops, and suddenly they've lost something. An option, a freedom, a protection. You think they're reading footnotes in your decisions? No, they just know what hurts." Gorsuch said nothing, just nodded faintly, as if acknowledging the distance De Niro described. "And when I criticize this court," De Niro continued, "I'm not just aiming at one justice. I'm talking about a pattern that makes people feel smaller, less free, less heard. And if that's contempt, well then maybe this country needs more contempt." That got a reaction, a stir in the gallery. Someone near the back murmured, "Damn." Chief Justice Roberts cut in, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. De Niro, are you suggesting that dissent alone justifies disruption?" "No," De Niro said, turning to him. "I'm suggesting that when dissent gets punished as disruption, we're already on the wrong road." He stepped away from the podium, then back again, like a man pacing a living room, not a courtroom. "I've seen this before. I've played in it, sure, but I've also lived it. The moment when institutions start mistaking criticism for attack. The moment when power stops listening. That's how we lose the thing we're all pretending to protect." Justice Barrett interjected again. "And what exactly do you think we're pretending to protect?" De Niro looked at her, long and hard. "Legitimacy." Barrett's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You think people trust this court like they used to?" he asked. No, you've lost that. And I'm not saying it's all your fault, but it's real. And it's dangerous. Because once people stop believing in this bench, they don't stop believing altogether. They just start looking somewhere else, sometimes to dangerous places. Barrett sat back in her chair, silent. She didn't argue. She didn't agree. But she was listening, and everyone in the room could feel it. In the gallery, Pacino leaned forward, elbows on knees. Niro's daughter wiped a tear with a tissue she'd been holding since before the hearing started. Something was shifting. Niro let out a breath. I'm not a saint. I've made movies with blood and violence and madness. I've cussed out politicians and screwed up interviews. I'm not always polite. But this moment right here, I came into it with respect, not fear. Respect for the law, for you, even for the process that might throw me in jail today. He reached into his inside coat pocket and pulled out a photo, black and white, faded. He held it up, facing the bench. This is my mother, he said. Virginia Admiral, artist, poet, tough as nails. She raised me on her own, taught me to fight for what's right, not for what's easy. He turned to Barrett. She wasn't Catholic, didn't go to church, but she believed in something higher. That truth was sacred, that people mattered. And she believed deeply in this country, even when it disappointed her. He placed the photo beside the Constitution on the podium. She taught me that real faith means asking hard questions, that silence in the face of injustice isn't civility, it's complicity. There was a long pause. Then he looked straight ahead, into the silence, into history. I don't want to go to jail. But if speaking the truth about what I see puts me there, then so be it. You could hear the breath catch in the room. Barrett glanced at the Chief Justice. Roberts looked back at her, a silent exchange. Then she leaned forward, eyes locked on Niro. Mr. Niro, she said slowly, this court does not make decisions based on emotion. We uphold the law, but the law must serve the people. And that includes the people who speak out. Another pause. I believe your language was inappropriate. I believe your platform gives you extraordinary influence, and with that comes responsibility. But I also believe, her voice softened just slightly, that suppressing criticism, even strong criticism, can be a greater threat than the words themselves. She looked around at her colleagues. A few nodded subtly. This court, she continued, will not pursue a contempt charge. The gallery stirred, quietly, respectfully, but with unmistakable relief. Pacino exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 10 minutes. A journalist in the back scribbled wildly, already planning the headline. Barrett wasn't done. But let this moment serve as a reminder to all of us that democracy isn't tidy, it isn't comfortable, and it doesn't always sound polite. But it must allow space for disagreement. Otherwise, we're not preserving the Constitution, we're embalming it. She set down her pen. The hearing was over, but the story wasn't. Outside, as Niro exited through the main doors, the press surged forward. Microphones, flashbulbs, shouts. Mr. Niro, do you feel vindicated? Was this a win for free speech? Do you regret anything you said? He paused, looked out at the cameras, the faces, the country. I came here to be heard, he said. I was. Then he added, almost offhand, maybe we all were. And with that, he walked down the steps, older maybe, but lighter. Something had cracked open in that room. Not a revolution, not a collapse, just a breath of air where things had been tight for too long. and for a few brief moments the nation remembered what real disagreement could look like. Honest, passionate, grounded in truth, not tribalism. It wasn't perfect, but it was America. The days that followed felt different. Not quieter. This was still America in the age of 24/7 media and hyper-polarized news, but somehow steadier. The conversation had shifted, even if slightly, from outrage to reflection. Clips of the hearing flooded every major platform. On YouTube, the full footage trended for days. On TikTok, a 30-second snippet of Niro placing the Constitution beside his mother's photograph went viral, overlaid with soft piano and the caption, "This is what patriotism looks like." Even cable networks that usually lived on opposite planets found a strange moment of overlap. Fox ran a special segment titled, "Niro Walks the Line." MSNBC simply called it "Courage in the Chamber." Legal analysts debated the implications. Some said Barrett had preserved the court's dignity without appearing authoritarian. Others said she blinked under pressure. But a quieter majority praised her restraint and Niro's resolve, not because they agreed with either of them, but because they had watched two Americans from vastly different worlds meet, not with weapons, but with words. High school teachers started using the exchange in civics lessons. Universities hosted panels titled Niro vs. Barrett, The Role of Dissent in Democracy. A law school in Chicago even built a mock trial curriculum around the hearing. The event had become more than just news. It had become a case study. And for Niro, something changed too. He never asked for this moment. He hadn't gone on that podcast to pick a fight with the nation's highest court. But once it came to him, he took it seriously. He felt the weight of it, and he couldn't walk away from it now. 3 weeks after the hearing, he launched a new initiative, the Niro Forum. It wasn't flashy. No big corporate sponsors, no political endorsements. Just a series of small, local events, libraries, town halls, high school gyms, where people with wildly different beliefs came together to talk. Not to argue, not to win, just to talk. At the first event, held in a modest auditorium in Newark, New Jersey, Niro walked onto the stage wearing jeans, a black blazer, and the same Constitution from the hearing folded into his back pocket. He didn't give a speech. He just sat down across from a retired judge from South Carolina and said, "Let's talk about what the law means to us, not as experts, just as people who care." People showed up, not in stadiums, not in thousands, but enough. Enough to remind him that America still wanted to listen. It just needed the space. Meanwhile, Justice Barrett also made a move few expected. In her next public address, at her alma mater, Notre Dame Law School, she opened with words no one anticipated. "My job is to interpret the law," she said, "not to win popularity contests, not to avoid criticism. But criticism, even when painful, is not our enemy. Silence is." She paused, then added, "I believe Mr. Niro crossed a line, but I also believe it would have been a mistake to punish him for crossing it, because if the line can't handle a challenge, maybe it needs to be redrawn." The room was silent, and then applause, not thunderous, but real. That speech made its way around the internet, too, quietly, a sort of counterpoint to Niro's fiery monologue. And just like his words, hers resonated, not because they were perfect, but because they were human. By now, 6 months had passed. The headlines had moved on. Another election cycle was heating up. But the impact of that one courtroom confrontation lingered. A poll by Pew Research showed a curious spike. Public trust in the Supreme Court had nudged up. Not by much, just 3 points. But still, in a world where most institutions were hemorrhaging credibility, any upward movement was notable. Commentators credited the Niro moment, not because everyone agreed with him, plenty didn't, but because, for once, someone had spoken plainly, without spin, without calculation, and been heard. And the court, rather than retreating behind Latin phrases and arcane precedents, had responded with something resembling humility. At the same time, an op-ed in The Atlantic offered a different take. What saved the institution, it read, was not reverence for robes or tradition. It was a shared understanding that dissent, when expressed with sincerity, is not treason, it's tribute. And that sentiment, tribute, not treason, stuck. It became a kind of slogan for a country tired of shouting and craving conversation. It showed up on t-shirts, mugs, bumper stickers. Someone even painted a mural of Niro and Barrett, seated on opposite sides of a bench, Constitution between them. Tourists took selfies in front of it. No one quite knew whether it was satire or sincerity. Maybe it was both. Maybe that's why it worked. And somewhere in all this, something else happened. People started talking again. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years because of masks, vaccines, voting records, cable channels, started saying good morning again. A small thing, but important. A pastor in Tulsa said he used clips of the hearing in marriage counseling sessions. It's not about winning the argument, he told his couples. It's about staying in the conversation. In Milwaukee, a retired union leader and a Republican city council member co-hosted a local radio hour called The Bench and the Bronx, where they unpacked Supreme Court decisions in plain English and took calls from listeners. Their tagline? Talk like Niro, listen like Barrett. Corny, sure, but it worked, and maybe that's the point. This whole story, Niro standing alone in that courtroom, Barrett holding firm but listening, was never supposed to be a turning point. It was just supposed to be a sideshow, a celebrity making noise, a justice slapping back. But somehow, it became something bigger, a reminder that free speech is messy, that democracy is hard, that respect doesn't require agreement, and that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is look someone you fundamentally disagree with in the eye and say, I still think you're wrong, but I hear you. 9 months after the hearing, they met again. Not in a courtroom, not in front of cameras. At a small civic event in Michigan, part of Niro's Forum series, Barrett had quietly accepted an invitation to speak. No security detail, no entourage, just a folding chair, a microphone, and a cup of coffee. They sat side by side, still dressed very differently, still speaking from wildly different places. But they spoke about the law, about the court, about fear and anger and hope, about America. And by the end of it, people didn't remember who won. They just remembered what it felt like to be in a room where disagreement didn't mean division, where the Constitution wasn't a weapon or a wall, but a table, something you could gather around, even when you didn't see eye to eye. Maybe that's the ending we needed. Not a verdict, not a victory lap, just a conversation. And in a country that's forgotten how to have them, maybe that was more radical than any ruling could have been.